Ani bonjour, and welcome to Anishinaabemowin Word Parts. Join myself, Rochelle, and Dené while we work on improving our understanding of an important aspect of Anishinaabemowin and discuss our experiences as Anishinaabemowin learners, users, and teachers.
This is a learning journey, a starting place for further exploration. Do not mistake our enthusiasm for any kind of authority. We have learned from amazing speakers, but we make mistakes and misunderstand things.
Always check in with speakers and learners in your area to find the words and word parts that work best for you. Nahau, bajtada.
Ko miigwich bisnadawiyeg, kinuia nin bindagagijgu kwe dishnekanagu, Winnipeg and Dishda, Geget, Genondon il, Anishinaabe Word Parts, miigwich bisnadawiyeg.
Ani Kinawea, Rochelle and Dené, Toronto, Indida. Hi, everyone. I'm Rochelle, and I am coming to you from Toronto. And as Dené said, you are listening to, or you are hearing, actually, Anishinaabemowin Word Parts. And we are in our summer sessions. This is the fourth episode, continuing to listen to clips from our interview with Alan Corbiere, which has been absolutely amazing. So many different topics, so many things that I've been mulling over this summer. So I'm really grateful to Alan for having come and spoken with us and for all of you for listening. We did have some technical difficulties. So in this episode, again, we don't have video and we do have a slightly lessened sound quality, but it is more than made up for in the content that Alan shares. Just really inspiring and important and making so many connections. I think when we started the show, we had an idea of what we're going to talk about. And I think these last four episodes have just really blown that wide open. There have been so many interesting things to think about and also incorporate as we go forward.
So before we get into the audio, sharing everything that Alan shares, this is the final installment in this series with Alan. We get to hear him talk about his passion for documenting and understanding bird and plant names. And this really, really gave me great perspective on not just the importance of word parts, but really how they get put into action in lots of Anishinaabe understandings of bird and plant names. And so we'll talk a little bit after we hear him about how this has impacted our own journey and what that means. And I really appreciate Alan's from Chiking and sometimes as learners we're criticized for learning from speakers and people from other regions, but Alan doesn't believe in that. And I appreciate him so much to that he really talks more about as Anishinaabe how we're all connected through our understanding of these plants and animals and the biological worlds that we have relationship with, even if our relationships are different. And so a lot of this episode, I think, is about those relationships, about understanding the language through some of those relationships and what exactly it can tell us about our ancestors and the way that they lived. So, two things I want to point out as well before this episode starts, because as we were talking to Alan, he was very kind and held up some books to show us. And so they're not named in this episode, but I want people to know we're going to put them in the show notes as well. The first book that he talks about is called The Poplar River Plant Guide, and it was printed by the Manitoba Museum. It is available online from the Manitoba Museum, also the Manitoba Indigenous Cultural Education Center, and it's based on understandings and relationships with plants from the elders and speakers in Poplar River. So, Poplar River, Manitoba is a fly-in community about halfway up the province on the east side of Lake Winnipeg and home to a UNESCO World Heritage Site called Pimachouanaki. So, really beautiful place, lots of knowledge and understanding of plants and the relationship that people have with their environment from that community, and lots of love was put into this book. So, Poplar River Plant Guide is the first book that he references. The second book that Alan talks about is a super amazing book called The Plants Used by the Great Lakes Ojibwe. So, this book was a bit older. It's been around for many, many years, and it's quite thick. It's available for purchase at lots of different retailers as well as Amazon and all those places you can buy books. But the cool thing about this book is that our friends from the Midwest Indigenous Immersion Network, which is MEAN, MIIN, meanojibwe.org, have a link to the digitized version of this book. So you can go to their website. We'll put it in the show notes as well. You actually can download this book and search through it to find some of the things that Alan's going to talk about. So once again, it's called Plants Used by the Great Lakes Ojibwe. So those are the two books. That's all I wanted to do to introduce this episode. Do you want to add anything, Rochelle?
No, I guess with that, we'll send you to Alan O.G. Corbiere sharing this last installment of his interview here on Anishinaabemowin Word Parts.
We have words for the majority of these indigenous birds and animals here. But people just, quickly say, well, I don't know what that is. Let's just name it this.
You've done some research around like plants and morphemes related to plants. Is that something that you're still working on?
Plants and birds, but I got beat. I'm too slow. There's already an excellent book out there. You may have seen this, Dené.
Yeah, I have one of those.
Manitoba Museum put this out. So they compiled old ethnographies like Francis Densmore and the other fella was named Gilmore and others, and then they asked elders about the names as well. So there's what I was interested in though was not just the names per se. In my master's thesis, I was trying to get this. They call it ideological study, why something gets named that, based on its ontological status. So, like with birds, of course, sometimes you get their like ko, it's just based on the sound it makes, or oh, they say the same thing. It's the sound that it makes. But then you have others that have that describe the feathers, or one of the ones that I've never figured out, but is that moningone for a northern flicker, and of course, monage is you're mining or you're digging a hole, and then but ningone is about the feathers. Gone is specifically about the quills and the feathers. So I never got to ask anybody, but I was like, and when it's mo, then it's like, does that mean wink? So anyway, there's all these names with that gone in it, about the feathers. So you have these names. Ashquaganebe is one of these names. And we have all these beautiful names with that. And so that was why I got into trying to find this out, because it was more about the morphemes of those old names. And that's the thing that we should be studying. But with the plants, one of the things was my dad and Marianne Corbiere actually asked me. She says, "Ask your dad what's the difference between Matigamish and what was the other Matigamin is just the acorn, the word for the oak tree, and then the bur oak was a different word." Anyway, so my dad, we went up to a part of the reserve, and then I recorded him telling her, this is the word for this one, and this is the word for that. And it was they're both based on Matik, but the ending is the part that it will tell you kind of what it's about. So that mish seems to be more about of a pulpy wood. So, and then another one I had, we all know wigwas is birch, and then the longer form is wigwas atik. But there's Odawa people that will say wigwas mish. And so then that mish again makes that kind of about wonder if it's about a different species of it. So then you get names like that, mish. And I wanted to put all the words of trees that are end with atik or mish. And like maple, so maple you have ninotic and then sinamish as well. So those are two different types of maple, but that why it's called Otic and why one is called a Mish at the end. That was the thing that I wanted to see what the, and then that would be, instead of just naming it, then we would have to, as Anishinaabe now, look at why did our ancestors call it that? They had, and to me this was the thing, they had a classificatory system that is different than the one scientific one we use now. So when I was a kid, it was King Philip's court jester spoke in class today, something like that. That was the acronym. So kingdom, and then Philip was phylum, and then class spoke was species, and class today, and species, and genie was in there, genus. So then that was the whole classificatory system was kingdom, phylum, species, genus, and I got some of those mixed up, but you know what I mean. So for us, we have a different way, and this would be evidenced in the plant names. And this was where, again, back to morphology. So you look at a word like Deminaga for the plants of the strawberry, and then metigamin. So gawange is also a different ending of a word about that plant, how a plant is. So what I my suspicion is, although we have this, but we got to actually look at all those that end in galwaj and mish, and then of course like the reeds in that, like a nakanash and a pakwayash and chikamigosh. You have to then put those all together and then say, okay, well, why are these all called ushk, and why are all these called end with mish, and why are all these end with hatik, and then why do these all end in galwaj, and then we'll start to discern our Anishinaabe classificatory system. That was the theory that I was wanting the students to try and to learn. Eh? Well, sometimes these words they different, they can reveal different things to us now, and everyone's all big on indigenous knowledge, but they don't look at our actual words of plants and the morphemes to actually then say this is actually it in practice.
So that brings me to something that I've been struggling with the last couple weeks. This happens every once in a while where I think I know something and then I find out I do not. Because I was listening to Basil's audio recordings, and in one of he talks about trees, and all of the fruit bearing trees are galwange. None of them are otic. So, like, I have been saying for a long time, Mishimanotic. And then I would just use that with any fruit tree. But for all of his fruit trees, he used Gallange. And I sat so sad on the streetcar because, you think you know something. Like, you think there's one thing you know. It's how to say apple tree. And then I have to start all over again.
What I think, this was actually one of the things. Mishamin was the other word that I was talking about for the oak. Mishamin and metigamin were the two oaks. What I think what Basil's talking about there is actually like a crabapple tree, instead of, because we do say Mishimanoptic for an apple tree, and if he was saying Mishimanagawaj, to me that's a smaller tree, and you know those ones that don't grow. They don't grow high. They're just a small apple tree. To me, the Ganwaj would be the smaller one. Yeah, and that's the part that needs research, is to say, okay, too bad we don't have him to ask, and that's why, like I said, Marianne asked me to go ask my dad, well, what's the difference between a Mitigmish and a Mishamish? And so that's why we went out into the bush to check it out and to look at it. But what I think we have to actually do is actually cut one down as well, and to look at the pulp, not just the leaf. because the leaf itself, you wouldn't name it Mishamish or Matigamish based on the leaf. You would name it based on the actual pulp of the wood. I would think. So anyway, I would actually, and this is what I just the way I am. I naturally do anyway. Is I actually pull all the words together that are documented of an apple tree. I triangulate, and that's what this book does beautifully. And the other book that's awesome, and Dene probably saw this as well. This is an oldie but a goodie. It's and it has all these. It pulls these words together. And the other thing is what it notes is when there's duplicate. The word for a plant in one region isn't necessarily the same of the word for the word in another region. So it has let's see here, balsam fir is an entry in Inanduk. And Ninanduk, that's would be the word for balsam fir. And I kind of understand it like it's related to Ninatik and Ninawish and stuff like that. But then they put here Bigio Wanduk, Jingup, and I know it as Jingup. So it's got three words, this balsam fir. And but they put it all in that same one, same entry. So, and it's just a compilation of everything that's been published. And I don't think they actually consulted elders on this. So here, like hemlock to them, they got the word for hemlock and is Galgagamish. That's what Densmore put. But the fella Gilmore and Baraga put Galgagawash, Galgagawansh or Galgagawish. So it's both, eh? Anyway, that's the thing that for when we're doing an actual study of the etiology and the etymology of these words and trying to discern the Anishinaabe scientific classification system of plants, you'd have to really look at pooling all that data together. And so I suspect, but I don't know off the top of my head, that the word for crab apple tree is Mishimanagawaj, and a bigger apple tree like a Macintosh or whatever would be Mishimanotic. That's what I just suspect, but I don't know that for sure. So, and then the other thing is when we look at these newer speakers, like Basil was pretty good, thorough and stuff. But sometimes people, like I said, with the turtles, they just make new words up. They don't bother looking at what was this word, and they just, well, I'm getting paid. I'm just going to put this, and I don't know if that's their attitude, but they just put that word. So that's why I always triangulate and ask different speakers what they've heard. And one of the interesting things right now, I grew up thinking that Guingwish was the Potawatomi word for blue jay, and Dindis was for the Ojibwe word for blue jay. So I started doing. I was involved in a different project on looking at the history of the Humber River watershed, and my colleague, because one of the chiefs that split from the Credit River Band was named Blue Jay. Just in English, it said the chief named Blue Jay left. So I told my colleague, well, let's look in the archives for anything in the archives that say Dean Deese. And anyway, then we found, and I said, or Guingwish. So then we started finding that back then, this is the mid 1800s, that Guingwish, it says Canada jay. And then another just said meat-eating bird. And so I was just like, what the hell? So we kept looking at it further. And then anyway, we pulled together all these different sources. And actually, that's what but on Manitoulin, people will say Guingwish is the blue jay, but it's actually the Canada jay, the whiskey jack. So that's just kind of how languages change and how populations of birds change. Like I haven't in here all my life, I haven't seen a Canada jay in this area. I saw them in Peterborough, but area, but I didn't see them here. So to me, it makes sense that we could have lost that that name of that bird. The other one that I'm really interested in is the sparrowhawk, and which of course some call some call the sparrowhawk, but it's American kestrel. And so Basil spells it BP Guises, and then sometimes BP Guises. So he doesn't he isn't really consistent in that one. So I was like, I looked at a couple of his things, and I'm like, he goes back and forth. I don't know which one it is, BP Guises or BP Guises. And then Pat Ningawas has a story, and she puts it as BP Guises. And then the Odawa and Larber Cross, they put BP Gwen. But when you look up BP Gwen in the dictionary, it means a nuthatch now. So anyway, to me, you need to have the proper word, and then I saw that Joe Pidawanakwit put on there that BP Gwen is the nuthatch, and it's named that because it destroys stuff, and that BP is meaning he's breaking something. Big ska, it's broken, So that's what he was told that. And the nuthatch, when it if you ever see where it feeds, it breaks up that bark, and they just leave these bark chips around, especially like off of a pine tree or whatever those. They almost come off like scales, So anyway, I don't know. Now I'm like, if you look in Rhodes Dictionary, BP, it says, I'm pretty sure it says nuthatch. And in BP, but BP Gwe and the Odawa, they would sign their clan with that sparrowhawk, and they would say that's their Doden. Then you look further west, it's BP Guizens, but also BP Guizens, and then Basil Johnson says BP Guizens. Anyway, I got to talk to some elders, find out what the actual name of that bird is.
I think also, like, I really like hearing about all these different names across, because I also think like all of these names came with the story of our relationship with that one. And certainly our relationships aren't necessarily the same. Like Miziwe Kumik, like everyone, these communities have stories related to all of these. So yeah, I think it's pretty cool to, that's why I like that second book that you talked about, because it has like, oh, in this community, if you can tie, if sometimes they mention like in this community, this is who they called it, in this community, this is what they called it. But even just traveling and visiting other ceremony people, like they have different relationships with trees, going back to our tree conversation, right? And the ones that serve relationship and responsibilities in their community for different roles. And so it's so interesting in those ideas around when you guys were talking about the Waj versus the Atik, and even like I'm thinking about the way I hear that get used over here. Just yeah, really interesting. But I think it all talks about relationship too. And so you can't just have these word parts without, like Alan said, without understanding and acknowledging these longstanding relationships that we've had.
Yeah, like what you just mentioned. I've seen reference a number of times of Gimawatik and then Gimawabo. And this was a thing that they did on King's Day here on Manitoulin. And they would drink, they called it a Gimawabo. And so I assumed it was the maple tree was being called a Gimawatik, and that the Gimawabo was the drink made from the sap. But then you go to other places, then that chief tree is actually like a poplar or a different tree. It isn't the maple. And then I just was reading something, but of course people like would say this, that from Garden River area, that Jingwak, because their big chief, their most famous chief is Jingwakos. They say that that's the actual Gimawatik, is the pine tree. So you got three possible: the pine tree, the poplar tree, or the maple. So, and it depends on the context. Like I was saying, that ceremony and after New Year's, they would do that, and it was called King. It still is called King's Day, but they would have this ceremony, and they would drink that a drink from that, and they would have that from that Gimawatik, they called it at that time. So Anyway, like you said, it's different cultural expressions and different ceremonies, and maybe he's the chief at a different chiefs.
The other thing I wanted to ask, and maybe we'll just do this quickly if you're willing, is sometimes you talk about this using like examples that English speakers are used to, like phone and micro and stuff like that.
Oh, you mean the Latin that? Yeah, our like I usually tell people our language is agglutinative. That's the fancy term, but it means it's just like Latin. So when we say uh, periscope, telescope, and microscope, all we've done is change the initial morpheme, micro, tele, and peri, and we put it with scope. So of course you can do the same, but with phone. So you change scope with phone. Now you got, I don't know if there's such thing as a paraphone, but you got a microphone and you got a telephone. So that's all we're doing with it in Latin. That's how Latin works. You put those parts together. So if you're a scientist and in any kind of scientific field, usually you use Latin a lot. And then you can actually get you don't have to speak Latin, but when you see the label of something, you already have a general idea what it is because you know the morphemes that are used to. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but one of the things I finally clicked in, like this is kind of a horrible example, but it's an example that everyone knows, is I didn't realize this with side. So pesticide, you're killing pests. Fratricide, you're murdering brothers. And homicide, you're killing humans. And then genocide on the mass scale, and then suicide. And I didn't know that, because then I was reading this thing again about how quote unquote Indian rights should be approached as a sui, and I don't know how to say it, generous. It's a Latin term that means a thing of its own, and that sui part is the part that makes it of its own. And so, anyway, so then that's when I was like, oh, that's like a patricide, matricide, and all this. It's the same thing, and it's again But I never clued in that we unconsciously see and hear all these words, and they're in English, but they actually have a Latin base, and they're just using morphemes the same way we do in Ojibwe. Word parts that don't have their own meaning on their own, like homie. You could say homie, but you don't really know that you're really referring to homicide. And then geno, it could be Genoa, salami, or whatever, but it's actually in this case genocide. And then so all these words, they don't have a complete meaning on their own, but you got to fit them together with something else, and that's the same thing with Ojibwe. But like I said, at the beginning, what's happening is now people are saying Odzuin, and that Odze is a morpheme, but it isn't a word on its own. But people, you got to have that N in front of it, say Notzuin or Bimodzuin, or it needs something else, but people are using it as a word Odzuin. And it's like, oh, don't use that as a word. It's a morpheme. It needs something in front to complete it. So that's the thing that we're starting to. Seems like we're starting to go in a ditch on some of these things. So hopefully that gets rectified. But people get mad when you correct them, and then they get all defensive and they say, "Oh, why bother learning then?" kind of thing. And it's like, it's not all or nothing, you know. You can get corrected some ways, you know. But anyway, yeah, that's the thing with Latin. So if you read you take anything scientifically, photosynthesis, and that you'll know a photo, of course, photograph, anything with photo about light, eh? So that's the thing that it's very similar structure wise that can be used to explain what we already do in English. We can use and transpose that in Ojibwe. And in fact, here's another thing. I was talking to the late Cecil King, and Cecil King is a Odawa from Wikwankong, but he moved out to Saskatchewan and was a professor out at the Saskatchewan Federated Indian Colleges. And he retired, and then I got talking to him, and he was saying, I saw on the internet they put an ad out for different languages to coin new words. And he says, and it was stuff like nuclear fission, nuclear fusion, microwaves, all this kind of stuff. And he says, and what I thought I did was I actually just pulled apart I looked up their word roots of those words that they wanted and went back to the Latin and was the word parts that I used. And then I looked for the Ojibwe corresponding Ojibwe one. And then I slotted them together. He says, I don't know if anybody else would pick up on that. And, but they were paying me, I forget, I think he said $1 a word. So he says, I forget how much money I made on the side just doing that. So that was a thing that he, of course, he was an elderly, a fluent speaker in that. And so the words must have made sense to him. But I often wondered, where did that word list go that he made, and just using Latin morphology and matched it with the Ojibwe morphology, and then it came up with a new set of scientific terms, but based, of course, on Latin.
Absolutely. I think of all these groups that are getting together to come up with these like quote unquote new words and this all this idea of this like modern technology and where all these word lists are going. But I feel like that's a whole other episode. Thanks for coming on and chatting with us and talking about the language and doing all that great stuff with Rochelle and myself. And I really enjoyed this time together. We could probably sit here all afternoon.
We covered quite a bit, but thank you both for inviting me and putting up with the duration. And as my daughter says, king of the blab.
Wow, that was a lot of information to think about. So much appreciation for OG, for Alan Corbiere, for sharing all these things. And really, I feel like bringing this all home in this fourth installment of what it is that he's sharing with us and really making this applicable to some of his learnings and the way that he's learned the language and just is continuing his work at this stage.
I also like the connections between, being a language learner and those other parts of your life. Like it doesn't have to just be doing the work in the classroom and then leaving language behind. You can bring it into so many parts of your life, and there's so many areas yet to be properly researched.
Yeah, the work is endless, just like the amount of episodes where we could do on word parts is endless, just the amount of things that could be studied, right? You don't have to just be a grammar teacher. You can be, a scientist documenting taxonomy, which is really what Alan was talking about here. So I really love this idea that he brought up and the idea that of what we understand as the scientific classification and it's just been dominated by this Latin understanding, right? And so when he talked about everything in the world, all the animals and plants have this classification system that scientists use called taxonomy. And so it goes through all the 8 levels. You can tell neither of us are scientists at this point, but I really appreciate that he tried to connect that. So there is a taxonomy that's done in the sort of Western science world. So of course there would be a taxonomy that the Anishinaabe people would have for our own understanding of our relationship with those trees and plants and birds.
There aren't that many places in English where we connect to these ideas. And so that's one of them where we can kind of say, oh, so I don't totally know what you're talking about with Shell with this word parts, but I do understand that. Like when kids are little and they're all into dinosaurs, you do start to recognize that like there are parts that are the same depending on the species or whatever. And so it's more relatable than my general trying to convince everyone that word parts are amazing.
Early on in this journey, I was explaining to my mom, who was a nurse, what the word parts are and how the language works. And she's not Anishinaabe, so she was trying to understand. Well, what do you mean by word parts? How does that work? And what exactly does all that mean? But she was a nurse, and so I figured out really quickly that if I explained it, because they use these word parts in the names of medication. And so when I explained, well, at the beginning does this, in the middle does this, and the end does this, and she was like, oh, well, that's the scientific name of medication, and that's how the scientific name of medication is created. And it talks about the body part it impacts, the type of illness it works on, and the type of medication it is, and something like that. I thought it was really, really interesting because it was just such a clear connection to this idea of agglutinative language, connecting those parts together to have a larger meaning.
Yeah. Actually, that reminds me a little bit of Alan talked about his friend who went back to the Latin names of things to try and inform the Ojibwe word in creating these new phrases and new ideas. Really interesting how these languages, so different in many ways, can support each other and can have like common understandings.
Yeah, I really love this too. It sent me down a bit of a research hole, and I love doing that kind of research when Alan was talking about um, because sometimes as a learner, we're frustrated or challenged or whatever. Another challenge that we experience is like, well, we call it this, while this other community calls it that. And over here, we use this word and blah, blah, blah. And it's hard to sometimes understand, well, like, why can't we just call it an elm tree? Like, why does it have to have all these different names? He really demonstrates really well about how those relationships with those trees could be impacted over time and have different relationships with different people. So understanding regionally how that impacts exactly how things are, I really really love that because, like I said, in the Northwest we don't have maple trees. We don't really have that maple sugar season that seems to all my other Anishinaabe friends everywhere, like that's their life for this sort of 6-week period in the spring. And I'm like, well, we're still in the snow over here. We don't be doing that. So what did we do? We had to be doing something too. And so I appreciated that so much.
It helped me feel like it maybe healed me a little bit because I spent so much time learning in different spaces, and everywhere I would go, people would just say that I was wrong. And because, they had all learned from the same person, so they all knew the same word, and whatever I was saying was incorrect. And so then I'd take on what they said and I'd, carry it for a while. And then someone would tell me that that was wrong. And so I just spent so much time going into places being incorrect. So it was a little bit of a relief to be like, oh, it's just I didn't have them matched up, the right group with the right word. But actually, at the end of it, now I know like 5 different words for a lot of things. And so when people are talking, I have an easier time following the conversation or understanding because I just have a more flexible vocabulary. Whereas a lot of other learners, when people start using different words, they really are kind of stuck.
So I appreciated these two resources that he brought up, like we mentioned earlier. They're the Poplar River Plant Guide, produced in Manitoba, and well as the plants used by Great Lakes Ojibwe, and really kind of also demonstrated for us how those resources can be used, and you don't have to look at them as sort of a singular source of the all-knowing and all great being of correctness, but to say, oh well, if that's your Ogemawa tick there, and then this is a different Ogemawa tick over there. It must really demonstrate, and there must be more of a story there. Must be more of a story that tells us about what was going on in that community at the time.
And I liked also the connection between animals, plants, and just our regular verbs, that how these names, if you learn a bird name, those parts might still work in other words. So it's not just, like in English, you learn a word and that's kind of its only meaning. But even if you're not really at the point where you're learning sentences and you're just learning nouns, you you're still putting things in your maybe pocket for the future, and you'll be able to pull out those pieces and use them in other words in the future. But it's summer now, getting to the end of summer. So hopefully people are out in the world seeing birds, seeing plants, 2 new resources that we can be using to try and use the language out in the world and activate our brains and our language.
2 summers ago, I really was on a mission to try to learn the tree names in Anishinaabemowin. I realized really early on that I don't know the tree names in English. Like, I don't know how to tell them apart. So I had to go down that journey, right? Where I had to be like, okay, in order for me to know which is which. I need to know how do you even tell trees apart? You have to understand all the structure behind that. And so also finding ways that these word parts are applicable to you. And one thing I did say was I'm not a scientist. I'm not an ornithologist. I don't actually know all the bird names in English. So trying to expect me to understand and know all the bird names in Anishinaabemowin is probably a bit of a leap. There's the ones that I really do want to know though. So and those make sense to me.
So this is the end of our little series with Alan, which has been amazing. And again, we just want to express our appreciation for Alan, for all the work he does, for his generosity and spending time with us and spending time with so many other learners. And, you know, in many ways, going ahead in that trail and leaving stuff for us to pick up, whether it's the curriculum from the ARP program, the Quizlets, the many times he's made himself available for lectures and for talks and on podcasts like this. So much appreciation to him for spending this time with us, and appreciation to all of you for listening. And yeah, we look forward to getting into some more word parts with you all in the coming weeks.
See you in 2 weeks.
Miigwech! This has been Anishinaabemowin Word Parts, written and produced by Dené and Rochelle.
A big miigwech to all the language teachers who have helped us along our learning journey. We hope we've represented the language well, and apologies to everyone for all the errors we made in this episode.
For every episode, we consult our favorite resources, Anishinaabemowin Online Dictionary, the Ojibwe People's Dictionary, Gukwam's Language, and Anishinaabemowin Reference Grammar.
For more information about the podcast or resources used in this episode, check out our webpage and social media.
Graphic design by Christy Belcourt. Artwork by Christy Belcourt and Norman Allen. Miigwech!
Miigwech!